Summer 1944, somewhere in occupied France. A German prisoner of war walks to the fence, looks an American guard dead in the eyes, and laughs. Not nervously, not quietly. He throws his head back and laughs like a man at a bar on a Friday night. His friends join in. Then, the whole row. Dozens of captured Wehrmacht soldiers behind American wire mocking the men holding the rifles. The guard doesn't speak German. He doesn't know what they're saying, but he can hear it. He can feel it. And somewhere in that laughter is something more damaging than a bullet, because a bullet you can see coming. This moment, this single humiliating scene, would eventually reach the ears of General George S. Patton. And Patton, the man who once slapped a shell-shocked soldier for showing weakness, was not going to let it go. What he discovered would shock him, not because the Germans were stronger, not because they were braver, but because the United States Army had walked into the greatest prisoner intelligence operation in military history, completely catastrophically unprepared, and the enemy knew it from the first day. By the end of this story, those same German prisoners would go silent. The laughter would stop. And the men who stopped it were not generals, not strategists, not decorated heroes. They were refugees. Men who had fled Germany with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the language in their mouths. Men the Reich had tried to destroy, who would come back and dismantle the Reich's greatest psychological weapon from the inside. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe that the most powerful weapon in any war is knowledge, and we're just getting started. This is the story of how a moment of laughter behind a fence changed the course of military intelligence forever. And it begins not with a general, not with a weapon, but with a fence a summer afternoon, and the unbearable sound of men who should have been broken laughing like they had already won. By the summer of 1944, the Allied forces had achieved something extraordinary. D-Day had succeeded. The beaches of Normandy had been taken at a devastating cost, more than 4,000 Allied soldiers killed on June 6 alone, but the foothold in France was real. The Germans were retreating. The Reich was bleeding from multiple directions. On paper, the momentum was overwhelmingly American. But momentum on the battlefield and control in the prisoner camps were two entirely different wars. In the weeks following the Normandy breakout, the United States Army found itself processing German prisoners of war at a scale it had never remotely prepared for. Tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers were being captured across France. Processing centers were overwhelmed. Interrogation teams were stretched thin. And the entire theoretical framework that American military planners had used to anticipate this situation was collapsing in real time. The assumption had been logical, at least on paper. A captured soldier is a defeated soldier. Strip him of his weapon, put him behind wire, feed him according to the Geneva Convention, and he will behave the way defeated men behave, sullen, compliant, broken. The natural hierarchy of war conqueror above conquered would assert itself automatically. This was the thinking baked into training manuals, into doctrine, into the confident planning sessions that had preceded the invasion. It was wrong. Completely, dangerously wrong. What American intelligence had failed to account for was a decade of deliberate psychological preparation inside the German military machine. The Wehrmacht had not simply trained its soldiers to fight. It had trained them to be captured. Specifically, it had trained them to treat captivity as an extension of combat, a different battlefield with different weapons, but a battlefield nonetheless. German soldiers arriving in American camps were not broken men. They were organized men. Within days of capture, sometimes within hours, senior NCOs and officers re-established command structures behind the wire. Soldiers who cooperated too willingly with American interrogators were identified, pressured, and in some documented cases, physically punished by their fellow prisoners. The internal discipline of German prisoner populations was in many camps more rigorous than anything the American guards could impose from outside, and the interrogation methods being used against them were, from the German perspective, almost embarrassingly easy to resist. American doctrine at the time relied heavily on what might be called the rapport and comfort approach. Treat the prisoner decently. Establish a human connection. Be patient. Create conditions where cooperation feels natural. For soldiers from some armies, this produced results. For a hardened Wehrmacht professional who had been specifically trained to recognize and exploit this exact approach, it produced something else entirely: contempt. The Germans had a word for it. They recognized the method, they had been briefed on it, and they treated it not as a threat, but as confirmation that their captors didn't know what they were doing. Senior prisoners coached junior ones on how to respond, what to say, what to withhold, how to seem cooperative while giving nothing of value. The Americans were being outmaneuvered at a table they thought they controlled, and in the exercise yards and mess halls when the guards couldn't understand them, they talked about it openly, freely, sometimes with great amusement. The laughter that reached Patton's ears was not random cruelty. It was the sound of professionals watching amateurs and finding the performance genuinely, helplessly funny. The guards pacing back and forth in the summer heat, rifles slung watching rows of prisoners who were behind the wire, running their own command structure and conducting their own debriefs. It was, from the German perspective, an almost theatrical comedy of errors. Patton was furious. That much is consistent across the accounts that survive. He demanded to know what specifically was happening, why his men were objects of mockery, and what was going to be done about it. His anger was, as his anger usually was, precise and directed. He did not want sympathy. He did not want explanations about how difficult the situation was. He wanted a solution, and finding that solution required understanding a man that almost nobody in the American military establishment had ever heard of, or more precisely a group of men scattered across the military intelligence apparatus who had been hiding in plain sight for years. His name for the purposes of the American Army was Fred Heckinger. He had been born Friedrich Heckinger in Vienna, Austria in 1910, the son of a middle-class Jewish family in a city that was even before the Anschluss beginning to show the fault lines that would eventually swallow it whole. He had grown up speaking German, the way Viennese people spoke it, not the clipped military German of Prussia, but the warm, layered, culturally saturated German of coffee houses and university corridors and opera houses. He understood the culture not as an observer, but as a native because he was one, or had been. In 1938, the Anschluss ended that. Austria became part of the Reich overnight, and for Jewish families in Vienna, what followed was not gradual, it was immediate. Heckinger got out. Many of his relatives did not. He arrived in the United States in 1939 with almost nothing. Some money, some contacts, his education, and a mother tongue that was now the language of his family's persecutors. He was not alone. Across the 1930s and into the early 1940s, thousands of Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria had made the same journey: lawyers, doctors, academics, writers, engineers, men and women who brought with them an intimate lived understanding of the society they had fled. They knew how Germans thought. They knew the class hierarchies, the military traditions, the psychological pressure points that no textbook could replicate. They knew the difference between a Prussian Junker officer and a Bavarian working-class conscript. They knew what pride meant to each of them, and what shame meant, and precisely where those two things intersected. When the United States entered the war, the Military Intelligence Service Language School, based first at Camp Savage in Minnesota, began recruiting these men aggressively. Many of them enlisted or were drafted, anglicized their names to protect family members still in Germany, and were trained in interrogation methods that were at least initially the same inadequate methods that were producing the laughter behind the wire. Heckinger arrived at an interrogation center in France in the summer of 1944, carrying with him something that no amount of training could manufacture: the ability to listen to a German prisoner and understand not just the words, but everything behind the words. The class signals in the vocabulary, the regional accent that placed a man's hometown within 50 kilometers, the specific military jargon that identified a unit, a division, a role, the micro-expressions of pride and contempt and fear that only someone who had grown up in that culture could read with any accuracy. And what he observed in his first week at the interrogation center confirmed everything that the worst assessments of the situation had suggested. The American approach was failing. Not because the interrogators were unintelligent or unmotivated, but because they were operating without the cultural map required to navigate the terrain. He sat in on a session with a captured Wehrmacht officer, a man in his late 30s, professionally composed, answering every question with technically compliant but operationally useless responses. The American interrogator was using the rapport approach, offering cigarettes, speaking calmly, building toward information through comfort. The German officer was behind his correct and cooperative exterior, running rings around him. Hechinger could see it. The slight elongation of pauses before certain answers. The particular way the man's posture shifted when questions approached sensitive territory. The carefully calibrated vagueness that sounded like cooperation but contained nothing. After the session, Hechinger went to his commanding officer with a proposal that was received initially with something close to the same skepticism that had greeted many unconventional ideas in this war. He wanted to restructure the entire interrogation process. Not refine it, restructure it. From the ground up. Starting with the environment before a single question was asked. The idea had several components, and each one seemed to the traditional military mind somewhere between unusual and outright insubordinate. First, German-speaking personnel men like him needed to be deployed into the prisoner populations themselves. Not visibly, not in uniform, but embedded posing as fellow prisoners, listening to the conversations that happened when the Germans believed no one who mattered could understand them. Second, the formal interrogation sessions needed to be preceded by a systematic mapping of each prisoner's psychological profile rank, regional origin class background, ideological commitment before a single question was asked in a formal setting. Third, the physical environment of interrogation needed to be redesigned to create specific psychological pressures tailored to the individual, not a one-size-fits-all approach that the enemy had already learned to resist. His commanding officer listened. Then he said words that Hechinger would remember for the rest of his life. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, you're done. That was the authorization. Conditional, skeptical, grudging, but real. And Hechinger took it and ran. The first phase was the listening operation. 3 German-speaking personnel were inserted into a prisoner compound in late July 1944, posing as recent captures, wearing Wehrmacht-appropriate clothing, carrying fabricated backstories that had been constructed with meticulous care. They ate with the prisoners. They slept in the same barracks. They participated in the internal life of the compound, the complaint sessions about the food, the card games, the quiet conversations in the evening, when the guards were distant and the darkness felt private. What came out of those 2 weeks was staggering. The German prisoners, utterly confident that their conversations were private, spoke with an openness that would have horrified their officers had they known. Unit designations, the names and locations of commanders, assessments of morale in other units, who was cracking, who was holding who, had already decided privately that the war was lost. References to fortifications to supply lines to the timing of planned counteroffensives that soldiers had overheard or deduced from the movement of materiel around them. The information was flowing. It had always been flowing. It had simply required someone capable of hearing it. Hechinger compiled the first intelligence report from the listening operation in early August 1944. It ran to 47 pages. Senior intelligence officers who reviewed it described it in internal communications that survived classification for decades as the most operationally valuable prisoner-derived intelligence document produced in the European theater to that point in the campaign. Specific artillery positions were identified. 2 command posts that had been successfully camouflaged from aerial reconnaissance were located based on casual references in prisoner conversations. The timing of a planned German counterattack in a sector south of the main Allied advance was confirmed by 3 separate prisoners who had no idea they were talking to anyone who could understand them. When the formal interrogation sessions began, informed by the intelligence already gathered and tailored to the specific psychological profiles of individual prisoners, the results compounded. An officer whose identity was rooted in aristocratic Prussian military tradition responded to an interrogation approach built around flattery and the implicit suggestion that his professional judgment was being respected by men who understood what real military competence looked like. He talked for 6 hours. A working-class conscript from the industrial Ruhr, terrified and isolated, responded to simple human warmth and the implicit promise that cooperation meant safety. He confirmed details about a supply depot that air assets destroyed within 72 hours. The approach spread. Other refugee interrogators adapted it, refined it, applied it across multiple compounds. The intelligence pipeline that had been a trickle became something closer to a flood. And in the compounds themselves, something began to change. The discovery that German conversations were being understood, that the private, unguarded talk of the barracks was not private at all, moved through prisoner populations like a cold current. The confidence that had sustained the laughter, the collective sense that the captors were legible and manageable, began to crack. If the Americans had been listening, what had they heard? What had already been given away? The paranoia this produced was itself a weapon. Soldiers who had maintained confident solidarity began watching each other. The internal hierarchy that had been the source of that solidarity became a source of suspicion. In the words of one American intelligence officer, whose report was eventually declassified in 1987, the change in prisoner demeanor was visible and measurable within 3 weeks of implementing the new methods. The boisterous collective confidence that had characterized the prisoner population was gone. What replaced it was something much more useful to us: uncertainty. The laughter had stopped, and Patton, receiving intelligence reports that were suddenly producing actionable results, did not ask too many questions about how. He was a general. He cared about outcomes. The outcomes were changing. But here is what Patton did not know. What almost nobody in the senior command structure yet understood was that what Hechinger and the other refugee interrogators had built in France was not a solution. It was a prototype, a proof of concept. The real test was coming, and it would be larger, more dangerous, and more consequential than anything that had happened behind the wire in the French summer, because the Germans had noticed that something had changed, and they were adapting. In the prisoner compounds that had gone quiet, new instructions were filtering down through the remaining hierarchy, instructions that suggested someone on the German side understood exactly what had happened and was preparing a counter. A new layer of resistance, more sophisticated, more deliberately structured, designed specifically to defeat the method that had just defeated them. And at the same time, the war was moving. The front was advancing. The scale of prisoner processing was about to increase by an order of magnitude. What had worked for dozens of compounds would need to work for hundreds. The men who had built the system were few. The demand was becoming enormous. And somewhere in the Reich's military apparatus, someone had begun preparing a response. In Part 2, we go deeper behind the wire into the compounds, where the new German resistance was taking shape, into the interrogation rooms, where the refugee interrogators faced prisoners who had been specifically trained to defeat them, and into the extraordinary lengths that American intelligence went to in order to stay one move ahead. The question is simple. The system worked once. But could it work when the enemy knew it was coming? In the summer of 1944, a refugee named Fred Hechinger walked into a prisoner compound in France and did something the United States Army had never tried before. He listened. Really listened. He embedded German-speaking personnel inside the compounds, mapped the psychological profiles of every prisoner worth interrogating, and extracted intelligence that located artillery positions, command posts, and the timing of German counterattacks. The laughter behind the wire stopped. The system worked. But that was one compound, one test, one summer. Now the front was moving east. The prisoner population was exploding by the tens of thousands. And deep inside the remaining German prison hierarchy, something new was forming, a countermethod specifically designed to defeat everything Hechinger had built. The men who had been outwitted once were not going to be outwitted the same way twice. Here is the number that explains why the next phase nearly ended everything. By September 1944, American forces were processing over 30,000 German prisoners per month. Hechinger's entire trained listening team numbered fewer than 40 men. 40 men against 30,000 prisoners. The math was a death sentence for the program before the Germans even had to do anything. And then the institution got involved. That made everything worse. Colonel Raymond Harwick had spent 22 years in military intelligence. He was not a stupid man. He was in many ways exactly the kind of officer the Army needed: disciplined, methodical, experienced in the bureaucratic architecture of wartime command. He was also the kind of man who had built his career on a specific set of doctrinal principles, and who regarded deviation from those principles with the same suspicion he would apply to an unfamiliar weapon handed to him by a stranger. Hetchinger's methods were to Harwick a deviation, and in late September 1944, at a briefing room in a requisitioned French schoolhouse outside Nancy, Harwick made his position clear. "What you are describing," Harwick said, looking at the intelligence report Hetchinger had placed on the table, "is unauthorized insertion of personnel into prisoner populations. That is a Geneva Convention gray area at best, and a court-martial offense at worst. Beyond the legal question, you are telling me that the foundation of your method is eavesdropping. You are not interrogating these men. You are spying on them while pretending to be one of them. And you want me to scale this across the entire European theater." Hetchinger kept his voice level. "The results in the report speak for themselves, sir. Results in a single compound over 6 weeks. I have 20 years of results, Lieutenant, across 3 continents, and none of them required me to dress my men as prisoners and hide them in barracks. With respect, sir, none of your results stopped the laughter either." The room went very quiet after that. Harwick looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You are relieved of independent operational authority effective immediately. You will return to standard interrogation protocol. If I find that you have continued these methods without authorization, I will have you reassigned to a supply depot in Algiers." Hetchinger walked out of that meeting with nothing. No program, no authorization, no institutional support. The 40 men he had trained were technically still under his nominal coordination, but without Harwick's sign-off, they couldn't be formally deployed. The system that had taken months to build could be dismantled by paperwork in 72 hours. Outside, the war continued. German prisoners kept arriving. The intelligence gap, the one his method had briefly closed, began reopening immediately. 3 weeks after Harwick shut down the formal program, an American armored column walked into an ambush near Metz that prisoner intelligence properly extracted might have prevented. 31 men were killed. Hetchinger read the after-action report in silence, but he had found an ally, and the ally came from the last direction anyone would have expected. Brigadier General Walter Lauer was not an intelligence officer. He was a combat commander, 99th Infantry Division, a man whose entire professional focus was on keeping his soldiers alive in the field. He had read Hetchinger's original intelligence report, not because he was interested in interrogation methodology, but because it had predicted the location of a German artillery battery that his forward observers had been searching for unsuccessfully for 11 days. The prediction was accurate to within 200 meters. Lauer tracked Hetchinger down through back channels and asked him a single question: "How many prisoners would you need access to in order to give me reliable intelligence on the German defensive line in my sector?" Hetchinger said, 50 prisoners 4 days, and authorization to use my methods without Harwick's office involved. Lauer said, "I can get you the prisoners and the 4 days. The authorization I can manage as a field operational necessity. My sector, my operational needs, my call." This was the loophole. Combat commanders in active operational sectors had a degree of intelligence authority that bypassed the standard chain Harwick controlled. It was narrow, it was technically arguable, and it would not survive scrutiny if examined too closely. But it was real, and Lauer was willing to use it. The plan they constructed together was audacious in its simplicity. Lauer would requisition a group of recently captured German prisoners for extended tactical debriefing under field operational protocols. Hetchinger's team would be inserted under the operational umbrella of the 99th Division's intelligence section, technically reporting to Lauer rather than to Harwick's office. The formal interrogation sessions would follow standard protocol on paper. Everything else, the listening, the mapping, the profiling, would happen under the classification of field operational necessity, which was the military equivalent of a locked box that Harwick didn't have the key to. They had one chance, one formal demonstration in a live operational context with real stakes. If it failed, if the intelligence produced was wrong or too slow or insufficient, Lauer's credibility would be damaged and the program would be finished permanently. Harwick would see to that personally. The prisoners arrived at the processing point near Elsenborn on a cold morning in late October 1944. 53 men, a mix of Wehrmacht infantry, and one captured signals officer whose presence Hechinger had specifically requested based on the unit markings on his uniform. Signals officers knew things. They heard things that crossed every command level. They were in the right hand's extraordinary sources. Hechinger's 3 embedded personnel went in with the prisoner group at 0600. Lauer's staff watched from a distance. Harwick, who had been informed of the exercise only in the most general terms, was 200 kilometers away in Nancy and did not yet know the specifics. The temperature that morning was 4 degrees Celsius. The prisoners were cold-tired and had been given hot coffee, a deliberate choice. Cold men given warmth talk. They talk about warmth. They talk about home. And when men talk about home, they talk about everything. By hour 6, the embedded team had compiled their first round of observed intelligence. The signals officer had spent 90 minutes complaining in specific operational detail about communication breakdowns between 2 German divisions, attempting to coordinate a defensive line east of the Siegfried position. He named units. He named frequencies. He referenced a command post by the name of the Belgian farmhouse it occupied. By hour 14, Hechinger was in front of Lauer with a preliminary intelligence assessment. The signals officer's farmhouse. 3 artillery positions whose locations had been referenced obliquely by multiple prisoners who had no idea they were being understood. A planned German withdrawal timeline, not a rumor, but a specific date referenced by an NCO who had clearly heard it from above and couldn't stop himself from sharing it with what he believed was a sympathetic fellow prisoner. Lauer read the document. Then he read it again. Then he looked up and said, "How confident are you in the farmhouse location?" 85%, Hechinger said. "High enough to act on." Lauer acted on it. Within 48 hours, a strike had been called on the coordinates. The farmhouse was confirmed as a command post. The strike disrupted coordination between the 2 German divisions for 72 hours at a critical phase of their defensive preparation. The artillery positions, 3 of them were located and neutralized within a week. The withdrawal timeline proved accurate to within 18 hours. In 4 days from 53 prisoners, Hechinger's team had produced intelligence that would have taken conventional interrogation methods 6 weeks to extract at best and might never have produced the specific operational details at all. Lauer sent his assessment to Harwick's office with a single cover note. "These results require your explanation for why this method is not standard practice." Harwick had no good answer. He had a procedural objection and a legal concern and 22 years of habit, but he did not have results. And in a war, results are the only currency that matters permanently. The program was formally reauthorized at the theater level in November 1944. Hechinger was given operational authority to expand the trained listener teams across 6 additional processing compounds. The 40 men became 90. Training protocols were standardized. The psychological profiling methodology was written into a classified field manual that would not be declassified for 40 years. The German prisoners noticed, not immediately and not all at once, but the paranoia that had begun in the first compound spread. Word moved through the prisoner network, not quickly, because the Americans were now disrupting that network deliberately, that conversations were being monitored, that the man in the next bunk might not be who he said he was. The confident collective silence that had replaced the laughter became something more fragmented, more suspicious, more useful. Prisoner intelligence yields across the compounds where the new methods were deployed increased by an average of 340% compared to the same compounds under standard interrogation protocol. Processing time for actionable intelligence from capture to usable field information dropped from an average of 11 days to under 72 hours. The system was working, scaling, spreading across the theater with the urgency of something whose value was now beyond institutional argument. But in the last week of November 1944, three things happened almost simultaneously that changed everything. The first, German military intelligence, through channels that would not be fully understood until after the war, became aware that prisoner compounds had been penetrated by German-speaking American operatives. New instructions were distributed through clandestine networks to German prisoners already in captivity, instructions on how to identify planted listeners, how to construct false intelligence that would seem credible, and how to feed the Americans exactly the wrong information at exactly the right moment. The second, a prisoner in one of Hechinger's most productive compounds was found dead. The cause was blunt force trauma. He had been identified as a source by the German prisoner hierarchy. He had been executed in his bunk in an American compound guarded by American soldiers who heard nothing. The third, Hechinger received a classified communication from a military intelligence officer stationed at a compound near the Belgian border. 3 of the intelligence leads his team had produced in the previous 2 weeks had been checked against field observation and found to be wrong. Not slightly wrong. Precisely surgically wrong. Wrong in ways that had almost sent an armored reconnaissance unit into a prepared German ambush. Someone inside the prisoner population was not just resisting. Someone was feeding them lies with a sophistication that suggested professional training. The Germans had not just adapted to the method, they had turned it around. They were now using Hechinger's own system against him. The listeners were being listened to. And the war that had seemed to be turning the war of minds behind the wire had just become something far more dangerous than anyone had prepared for. In Part 3, we go into the compound where the counterintelligence operation was running into the interrogation room where Hechinger came face to face with the man the Germans had planted, and into the most extraordinary psychological duel of the entire European campaign. Because the question was no longer whether the method worked. The question was whether it could survive being used as a weapon against its own creator. Fred Hechinger built a system that stopped the laughter. He embedded listeners, mapped hierarchies, extracted intelligence that located command posts, and predicted counterattacks. Then he fought the institution, found an ally in General Lauer, and proved the method worked. 340% increase in intelligence yield. Actionable information in under 72 hours instead of 11 days. The program was formally reauthorized. The listeners were spreading across 6 compounds, and then the Germans fought back. Not with weapons, with deception. 3 intelligence leads came back surgically wrong. A source was found dead in his bunk. Someone inside the prisoner population was feeding Hechinger's system precisely calibrated lies designed to send American soldiers into prepared ambushes. The listeners were being listened to. And in late November 1944, German military intelligence distributed something through clandestine prisoner networks that would be recovered only months later from a captured courier, a 7-page document titled in translation, Countermeasures for American Linguistic Infiltration Operations. The Reich knew exactly what was happening, and they had prepared a professional response. This was no longer an experiment. This was a war inside the war. The document Hechinger eventually read in a cold room at Fort Hunt, Virginia, 2 weeks after its recovery from the captured courier, was a masterpiece of psychological counterintelligence. It had been prepared by the Abwehr German military intelligence, with a sophistication that suggested the person who wrote it had either studied American interrogation methods in extraordinary depth or had access to someone who had been inside the program. Possibly both. The document identified 4 specific behavioral signatures of an embedded listener patterns of questioning that were subtly different from genuine prisoner conversation. Emotional responses that were professionally calibrated rather than authentically stressed. A tendency to redirect conversation toward operationally specific topics, and a particular kind of interested silence that trained listeners unconsciously deployed when subjects approached sensitive material. These were not obvious tells. They were the kind of micro-behavioral indicators that only someone who had studied the method from the inside could identify, and the countermeasures were equally sophisticated. German prisoners were instructed to construct what the document called layered false intelligence information that was accurate enough at the surface level to establish credibility, specific enough to seem operationally valuable, but wrong in precisely the ways that would cause maximum damage at the tactical level. Not obviously wrong, believably wrong. Wrong in ways that required field verification to detect by which time the damage would be done. The 3 false leads that had nearly sent American units into ambushes were not mistakes. They were proof of concept. Someone in the prisoner population was running this counter-operation with professional competence, and that someone had successfully identified at least one of Hechinger's embedded listeners and was using the listener's presence to feed poisoned intelligence upstream. The prisoner population across the 6 compounds had grown to over 4,000 men by December 1944. Hechinger had 90 trained personnel. The ratio made comprehensive counter-surveillance mathematically impossible. And with the German counter-document now in circulation through the clandestine prisoner network, the embedded listeners were increasingly at risk of identification, and the identified source in Compound 7 was already dead. Hechinger went to Lauer with the assessment and did not soften it. "We have a penetration problem," he said. "Someone in the population is running a professional disinformation operation. Until we identify who it is and neutralize the cell, every piece of intelligence coming out of the affected compounds has to be treated as potentially compromised. We cannot act on any of it without independent field verification. That means our response time goes from 72 hours back to days, possibly a week." Lauer was quiet for a moment. Then, "How many people know about the counter document?" "6, including you." "Keep it that way. If this gets back to Harwick's office, we lose the program. They'll use it as justification to shut everything down." He looked at the document on the table. "Find him. Whoever is running this. Find him and pull him out of the population." Harwick's office found out anyway. Not through Hechinger, through a junior officer in the processing chain who filed a routine incident report on the dead prisoner without understanding its significance. The report crossed Harwick's desk on December 3rd. Harwick called Hechinger at 0600 the following morning. "A prisoner died in your compound," Harwick said. "Yes, sir." "Under what circumstances?" "Internal prisoner discipline. We believe he was identified as cooperative with American personnel." A pause. "You believe?" "We are investigating." "Lieutenant, I am going to be in Elsenborn on December 9th. I want a full operational review. Every compound, every method, every result. If I find that your program has produced compromised intelligence that endangered American lives, I will shut it down and I will recommend court-martial proceedings. Do you understand me?" December 9th. 5 days. Hechinger had 5 days to find the man running the German counterintelligence cell inside his own prisoner compound, extract enough clean intelligence to demonstrate the program's value, and do it while operating inside a population that was now actively hunting his listeners. He found the man on December 7th. His name, his real name extracted eventually from Wehrmacht records, was Hauptmann Ernst Vogel. He had been captured near Aachen in late October, processed through standard channels, and placed in Compound 4 without anyone recognizing that his unit designation identified him as a former Abwehr field officer. He had been in the camp for 6 weeks. He had spent those 6 weeks running a counterintelligence operation of remarkable sophistication from inside a prisoner barracks, using nothing but the authority structure of the prisoner hierarchy and the document that had been smuggled to him through a chain of prisoner transfers. Hechinger identified him not through behavioral surveillance, but through mathematics. He cross-referenced the timing of every compromised intelligence lead against the movement patterns of prisoners between compounds. 3 of the 4 false leads had originated in compounds where Vogel had been housed in the preceding 2 weeks. The 4th had come from a prisoner who had been transferred from Compound 4 to Compound 7 4 days before providing the false information. Vogel had not moved. His influence had. The formal interrogation of Vogel was unlike anything Hechinger had conducted before. This was not a frightened conscript or a proud aristocrat whose vanity could be leveraged. This was a professional, a man who understood the method being used against him because he had built the counter-method. Flattery would not work. False confirmation would not work. The standard approaches were useless. What Hechinger did instead was something he had never tried before and would describe years later in a memoir that remained classified until 1991 as the most difficult hour of his professional life. He told Vogel the truth. He sat across the table from him in a room in Elsenborn and told him exactly what he had built, how it worked, what it had produced, and how Vogel had nearly destroyed it. He told him about the source who had died in Compound 7. He did not perform emotion. He stated facts, and then he said, "You are a professional. I am a professional. The war ends the same way regardless of what happens in this room. The only question is, how many more people die before it does? You have already helped extend it by several weeks. I am asking you to stop." Vogel looked at him for a long time. Then he said in German, "You speak like a Viennese." "I am Viennese," Hechinger said. Another long silence. "What do you want?" "The names of everyone you briefed in the other compounds." Vogel gave him 11 names. The counterintelligence cell was dismantled within 48 hours. By December 8th, one day before Harwick's review, Compound 4's intelligence yield had been cleaned, verified against field observation, and confirmed accurate across 7 separate data points. Harwick arrived on December 9th. He reviewed the operational record for 4 hours. He did not speak during most of it. At the end, he looked at Hechinger across the table and said, "The results are not in question. The methods remain problematic from a regulatory standpoint." He paused. "I am recommending full theater-level authorization, on the condition that all embedded personnel are formally documented and all intelligence is double-sourced before operational action." It was not an apology. It was a Harwick. But it was enough. The full authorization arrived in writing on December 14, 1944. 3 days later, the Germans launched the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and the entire theater went into crisis. The authorized program had arrived at exactly the moment it was needed most, in the 6 weeks of the Bulge. December 1944 through January 1945, Hechinger's expanded network of listener teams was deployed across 11 compounds, processing prisoners taken during and after the German offensive. The intelligence produced during this period would not be fully declassified until the 1990s, but the operational record tells a partial story that is remarkable by any measure. 17 confirmed artillery positions identified through compound intelligence before aerial reconnaissance located them. The timing and axis of the German withdrawal from the Ardennes salient, predicted within 18 hours by compound intelligence based on prisoner conversation, allowed Allied forces to position blocking units that captured an additional 2,300 German soldiers who might otherwise have escaped the encirclement. 2 German divisional command posts were located through compound intelligence and struck within 48 hours of identification. The broader numbers were equally significant. Compounds using Hechinger's methods produced actionable intelligence on 68% of prisoner intakes compared to 11% under standard interrogation protocol. Average time from prisoner intake to usable field intelligence dropped to 58 hours across the theater. False intelligence, the poisoned leads that Vogel's cell had introduced, was detected and flagged before operational action in every case after December 9th. The German military command, reviewing the intelligence failures on their side in January 1945, produced their own internal assessment, recovered after the war, that identified systematic compromise of prisoner communication security as a contributing factor in the failure of the Ardennes offensive to achieve its strategic objectives. They were correct. Hechinger's listeners had been in the compounds pulling threads the entire time. The men in the prisoner compounds went progressively quieter through January and February 1945. Not the quiet of discipline now, the quiet of men who had understood finally that they did not know who was listening. The psychological leverage that had produced the original laughter, the confidence that the captors were deaf to German was gone permanently. Hechinger received a commendation in February 1945, signed by Lauer, and forwarded to Theater Command. It was classified and remained so for decades. He did not receive a public decoration. He did not give interviews. He went back to work. By March 1945, the program had been replicated across the British American theater in modified form, adapted to conditions in the Pacific, and incorporated into planning documents for the anticipated occupation of Germany itself. What had started as one man listening in one compound had become foundational doctrine for how the Western Allies would manage prisoner intelligence through the end of the war and into the occupation that followed. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The system Hechinger built outlasted the war by decades. But here is what the commendation did not say, what the operational record does not fully capture, what the historians who eventually declassified the documents found themselves returning to troubled in memoir after memoir. What happened to the men who built this? The refugees who came back with nothing but their language and turned it into one of the most effective intelligence operations of the European war. What became of them when the war ended and the secrecy descended? Hechinger went back to journalism. Others vanished into careers that bore no visible connection to what they had done. Several died before the archives opened and before anyone thought to ask. Their names are not on the memorials. Their methods are in every intelligence doctrine produced by Western armies since 1945, unnamed and unattributed, the foundation invisible beneath the structure it supports. In Part 4, we find out what happened to these men. What the legacy actually looks like when you trace it forward through the Cold War, through Vietnam, through the interrogation rooms of the 21st century. And we ask the question that the operational record raises, but cannot answer. When you build a system that good, and then the system outlives you in silence, was it worth it? The story of the laughter behind the wire has one more chapter, and it is the one that almost nobody knows. From a refugee with nothing but his language, to a classified program that reshaped how Western armies fight wars of the mind. Fred Hechinger walked into a prisoner compound in the summer of 1944, listened where no one had listened before, dismantled a German counterintelligence cell from the inside, and delivered intelligence that shaped the outcome of the Ardennes campaign. The laughter stopped. The system worked. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. But the cliffhanger from Part 3 was never about the war. It was about the man. What happens to the person who builds something extraordinary in secret when the secrecy never lifts? What happens when the institution that nearly destroyed your work inherits it, repackages it, and moves forward without you? This story has one more chapter, and it is the one that changes what all the previous chapters mean. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Fred Hechinger was 34 years old, sitting in a processing facility in Germany, still working. There was no ceremony for him, no public commendation. The classified nature of his program meant that the commendation signed by Lauer existed in a file that would not be opened for public review for decades. He was demobilized in August 1945 with the rank of captain, a standard separation allowance, and the same instructions given to every intelligence operative: do not discuss the specifics of your work with anyone, ever. He went back to journalism. He had been a writer before the war, and he returned to it with the methodical precision of a man who had spent years listening to what people said when they thought no one was paying attention. He became, over the following decades, one of the most respected education journalists in the United States, eventually serving as education editor at the New York Times. His colleagues knew him as brilliant, precise, and unusually attuned to the gap between what institutions claimed and what they actually did. Nobody knew why he was so good at reading that particular gap. He never told them. His family, the ones who had not escaped Vienna in 1938, were gone. He did not speak about this publicly. He spoke about education policy and curriculum reform and the state of American schools. He wrote books. He received awards for journalism. He was, by any external measure, a successful man living a full life. What he did not receive in his lifetime was acknowledgement of what he had actually done. The program he built, the Listener Network, the psychological profiling methodology, The counterintelligence protocols he developed in response to Vogel's operation was formally incorporated into American military intelligence doctrine in 1946 under a classification level that effectively buried his name. The methods were attributed collectively to military intelligence service, language school, derived techniques. The individuals who developed them were not named. Hechinger knew this was happening. He had been told it would happen. He accepted it with the same professional equanimity he brought to everything else. Colonel Raymond Harwick, the man who had twice threatened to end the program and once threatened Hechinger with reassignment to a supply depot in Algiers, was promoted to brigadier general in 1946. His service record credited him with significant contributions to prisoner intelligence operations in the European theater. The operational review he had conducted on December 9, 1944, the one that had forced Hechinger to identify and neutralize Vogel's cell in 5 days, appeared in Harwick's record as evidence of rigorous oversight of a successful program. This is what institutions do. They absorb the outcomes and attribute them to the process rather than the people who built it against the process. General Walter Lauer, the combat commander who had given Hechinger the loophole he needed, did not forget. In 1962, when a journalist was researching a book on Allied intelligence operations in World War II, Lauer gave an interview in which he described a program of extraordinary effectiveness developed by a refugee intelligence officer whose name he gave as Hechinger, and whose contribution he called probably the most significant single development in prisoner intelligence operations during the entire European campaign. The book was published. The passage ran to 2 paragraphs. It was not followed up by any major publication for 23 years. Hechinger read the passage. He did not respond publicly. He kept working. The methods he built did not stay buried, even if his name did. The listener infiltration technique, the psychological profiling approach, the counterintelligence protocol for detecting disinformation within prisoner populations. These moved forward through the doctrinal architecture of American and British military intelligence, with the inevitability of ideas whose value has been conclusively demonstrated. They appeared adapted and renamed in Korean War prisoner intelligence operations. They formed a structural basis for certain elements of SEER survival evasion, resistance and escape training developed in the 1950s, which used detailed knowledge of prisoner psychology, derived partly from studying how German prisoners had behaved in American camps to prepare American soldiers for captivity. The knowledge flowed in both directions. What Hechinger had learned about how prisoners think under captivity became foundational to preparing American soldiers for captivity themselves. During the Vietnam War, military intelligence units operating in Southeast Asia used profiling and cultural linguistic analysis techniques that traced their doctrinal lineage directly to the 1944-45 European program, adapted for a completely different cultural and linguistic context, but built on the same foundational insight that understanding an enemy's psychology at the individual level produces intelligence that no amount of technical surveillance can replicate. The National Security Agency, in its internal histories of signals intelligence development, has noted the influence of World War II human intelligence methods on the subsequent integration of human and technical collection approaches. The specific program is not named. It never is. By the most conservative estimate, working from declassified operational records and post-war intelligence assessments, the intelligence produced by Hechinger's network during the 6 weeks of the Ardennes campaign contributed to operational decisions that saved between 3,000 and 5,000 Allied lives. The full 4-theater estimate accounting for all compounds, using the method from November 1944 through the German surrender in May 1945, is not publicly available. What is available suggests the number is significantly larger. 17 nations currently operate military human intelligence doctrines that incorporate foundational principles developed in those French and German compounds in 1944 and 1945. The system is now 70 years old. It is still running. The deeper lesson of what Hechinger built is not about intelligence methodology. It is about what happens when an institution confronts an idea that works better than what it already does. The American military in 1944 had a prisoner intelligence system. It was inadequate, and the evidence of its inadequacy was the laughter drifting across the wire in the summer heat. The institution's response to that evidence was not immediate adoption of a better approach. It was resistance, procedural objection, regulatory concern. The weight of 22 years of Colonel Harwick's experience pushing back against 6 weeks of results. This is not a story about military bureaucracy specifically. It is a story about the universal friction between demonstrated performance and institutional inertia. Every organization that has ever existed has a version of Harwick in it, someone whose authority is built on existing methods and who experiences new methods as a threat to that authority rather than an improvement on it. The genius of what Lauer did was not tactical. It was structural. He found the loophole. He gave Hechinger the one test that the institution could not procedurally block. And when the test produced undeniable results, the institution absorbed them, renamed them, and called them its own. This is also what institutions do, and it is in a perverse way the proof that the idea won. The parallel cases from World War II alone are instructive. Percy Spencer, a Raytheon engineer whose accidental discovery of microwave heating while working on radar technology led eventually to the microwave oven, a technology that the military had no interest in, and whose civilian implications took decades to develop. The Norden bomb site, championed by a civilian inventor against sustained military resistance, eventually adopted and used so extensively that it became one of the defining technologies of the air war. The tank itself in the First World War, proposed by Churchill against the objections of the army establishment, dismissed as absurd built anyway, and deployed in a form so compromised by institutional resistance that its potential took another war to be fully realized. The pattern is consistent across a century of military innovation. The idea that works arrives before the institution is ready for it. The person who carries the idea pays a price. The institution eventually catches up, takes the credit, and moves on. What makes Hechinger's case distinct is the dimension the refugee experience added to it. He did not simply bring a clever idea. He brought an understanding of the enemy that was irreplaceable because it was lived rather than learned. The Reich that had taken his family, stripped him of citizenship, driven him out with nothing, had inadvertently created the most effective instrument for dismantling its own psychological defenses. This is the irony that sits at the center of the whole story. And it is not a comfortable irony. It is the kind that requires you to hold two things simultaneously: the enormity of what was lost and the particular use to which the loss was put. Hechinger never wrote about this directly. In the memoir that was declassified in 1991, 6 years after his death in 1985, he addressed it once in a single paragraph near the end. He wrote, "I have been asked whether I found satisfaction in using what the Reich took from me against the Reich itself. The question assumes that satisfaction is available in such circumstances. What I found was utility. The language they left me with was the only tool I had. I used it. That is all. That is all." Here is the detail that almost nobody knows, the one that emerged from a 2003 declassification review of Fort Hunt operational records by the National Park Service's Oral History Project. Among the documents released was a partial transcript of a conversation recorded at Fort Hunt in January 1945 during the interrogation of a senior German signals officer. The interrogator is identified in the transcript only by a code designation, but the transcript includes a marginal notation handwritten in pencil that reads, "Note for record subject asked interrogator where he learned to speak German. Interrogator replied Vienna. Subject said, I know Vienna. My mother was from the 4th District. Interrogator said mine too." Conversation continued for 4 hours. Full intelligence report attached. The intelligence report attached to that transcript identified the location of a German signals relay station that had been concealed from Allied aerial reconnaissance for 3 months. The station was destroyed within 72 hours. The war ended 4 months later. 2 men in a room in Virginia in January 1945. One a prisoner. One a refugee. Both from the 4th District of Vienna. The city that the Reich had swallowed in 1938 produced from its destroyed Jewish community the man who would use a shared memory of its streets to extract the intelligence that helped end the war that destroyed it. Fred Heckinger died in 1985 without a public memorial, without a named building, without a statue. His declassified memoir sold modestly in academic circles. The Fort Hunt Oral History Project captured the testimonies of 4 surviving members of his listener network before that generation was gone. The recordings are held by the National Park Service. They are available to researchers by appointment. From a refugee journalist with a Viennese accent and 40 trained listeners to a classified doctrine used by 17 nations across 8 decades. From a prisoner compound in France where German soldiers laughed at American guards to an intelligence system that shaped the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge and outlasted everyone who built it. Heckinger never asked to be remembered. He asked only to be useful. He was more useful than anyone in the institution that employed him was willing to say out loud for longer than he lived to see. The Germans behind that wire laughed because they believed they were the only ones who understood what was happening. They were wrong. And the man who proved them wrong was the last person any of them would have expected a man they had already tried to erase. The most dangerous thing you can do to any enemy is truly understand him. The most dangerous mistake any institution can make is to exile the people who have that understanding. The Reich made both errors simultaneously. The results are in the record. The record is now open. The name in it is Heckinger.